When I was a kid, my parents used to take a lot of road trips. It seemed like nearly every summer, I'd be whisked off to a different part of the country for one reason or another. During the early 90s, my father was a representative for a retail company, and often was required to visit various locations and meet with the staff. While we didn't travel with him all the time, mostly when I was in school and during the winter, he did bring us along during the summer trips. It was like having a vacation every single year. By the time I was 10 years old, I had visited or at least driven through nearly every state in the US. There are quite a few states that stick out in my mind when I think back to those years. The first one has to be Florida. As much as Florida gets a bad rap for being the retirement capital of the world, the beach and the ocean at the time were incredible. I remember making sandcastles for hours, going snorkeling in the vast ocean, and eating exorbitant amount of room service food. Despite the relentless sun and the humidity, I actually had a great time there. Another state that comes to mind would have to be Texas. Seeing the Alamo and walking along the river in San Antonio, eating my entire body weight in barbecue, going to a real live rodeo. I wore cowboy boots for the rest of that year. Not all of the trips were pleasant, mind you. There was one in particular that simply thinking back to it makes me shudder. We were driving back home from California one summer. As we crossed the border into Missouri, I was staring out of the car window pretending there was an imaginary guy running alongside the car. I know it sounds silly, but it was just something I used to do as a kid. I'd pretend he was like a ninja weaving through trees, jumping over telephone poles, and dashing across guardrails. As this imaginary companion jumped and sprinted along, his image began to fade as my eyes started to focus on something else off in the distance. I raised my head and I could see it clearer with each passing second. Large arcing shapes in the distance, brightly colored spinning buildings. It was some type of fair or carnival. I called out to my mom and told her to look. She turned and gave the cliched mom response of, "Oh, that's nice, dear." Feeling defeated before I even start, I asked her if we could stop there. She told me that we couldn't spare any time, that we needed to make it home soon. I groaned quietly in the back seat. Meanwhile, my father, who was driving the car, looked at me in the rearview mirror. He gave me a sly wink and then turned off the highway. My mother scolded him for deviating, but he just said that he had been driving for hours and wanted to take a break anyway. My mom huffed in the passenger seat, while my eyes became glued to the window. As we approached, the attractions grew larger and larger. A towering Ferris wheel stretched high into the blue sky above. A few small roller coasters snaked out from the edges of the fair. Multicolored stands dotted the area on the other side of the chain link fence. We parked the car, and before the engine had been shut off, I was already standing outside. The sights, smells, and sounds assaulted my senses. I ran over to my dad's side of the car and tugged on his sleeve as he was taking his time getting out. Walking towards the entrance of the fair, I could feel a sense of wonder and excitement beginning to swell within me. I had been to fairs before, but I was always too short to ride any of the rides myself, so I often just played some games and ate some sugary snacks before leaving. This time, however, I was sure I had grown enough to ride many, if not all of the rides. As we walked up to the entrance, I looked up and saw a semi-rusted metal sign. The sign stuck out to me as odd, as the rest of the fair looked relatively clean and tidy. The sign that hung above looked old and weathered. Through the patches of orange-colored rust, the word Dreamland in faded yellow letters could be seen. As I walked underneath the sign, my father remarked that they should probably get a new one. Stepping into the fairgrounds was like walking into another world. Screaming kids rushing by while exhausted parents followed behind them. The ringing bells and buzzers from the multiple game stands echoed around me. My dad ushered us over to a small kiosk where a woman sat on her phone. Without glancing up, she droned, "Welcome to Dreamland. May all your dreams come true." My dad bought me a wristband which permitted me access to any of the rides. I thanked him and looked down at my wrist excitedly. Minutes seemed to fly by as I stuffed sugary candy and fried desserts into my face. I played and won multiple games, forcing my dad to hold on to my prizes as we walked along. As I waited in line for the Ferris wheel, my parents stood off to the side watching me. I approached the guy operating the ride and he looked me over for a moment. He told me to stand next to the height measurement sign. I swallowed my nerves and stepped up, trying to puff out my chest as if that would make me any taller. After a moment, he waved his hand at me to get on the ride. Relief and elation rushed through my mind as I climbed into one of the carts. As I rode the Ferris wheel, I was in awe of how far I could see. Glancing down, my parents looked like ants from all the way up there. Before I knew it, the ride was over, and I was rushing over to my parents to tell them how much fun it was. As we were walking along, my mother sighed and nudged my dad. He solemnly shook his head and told me that I could ride one more ride before we had to hit the road. I groaned once again, but understood. I looked around carefully, considering my options. There was the tilt-a-whirl spinning up right next to me, the oversized slide in the distance, the massive swinging pirate ship on my left. Those were all placed in the back of my mind as I looked at one of the two roller coasters this place had. I told my parents to follow me as I ran over to them. They begrudgingly followed along. Of the two coasters that looked nearly identical to me, one had a very long line while the other seemed vacant, aside from the attendant manning the ride. I rushed through the empty ropes and up to the man. He glanced down at me with a stern gaze. He didn't say a word, just pressed a single button on his console, and the gate behind him seemed to pop open. I entered and sat in the middle section of the 3-car ride. He walked over to me and lowered the bar. He leaned in real close to me for a moment and whispered, "Keep your arms and legs inside the vehicle at all times, or you might lose them." When he said that, it almost snapped me out of my excitement. He walked back over to his console and pressed another button. With a shift in momentum, I was pressed back into my seat as the ride started. The metallic clicks of the car being lifted high in the air vibrated through my shoes. The first car arched over the edge, and my car followed suit. Instantly, I could feel the wind pressing onto my face as I hit turn after turn. There was only a single loop in this ride, and I could feel the blood rush to my head and face as I completed it. The ride came around towards the end and began to dive. Right before the end of the ride, there was a long stretch of tunnel, done up to look like a mine shaft of sorts. The car entered it, and suddenly, without warning, the car abruptly stopped. I felt my stomach ache as it lurched into the safety bar. I could feel tears beginning to form as I was on the verge of crying from the pain, when I heard a sound in front of me. It sounded like someone was walking towards me. I wondered if it was the ride operator coming to get me after a malfunction. The sounds grew louder and louder, though I couldn't see anything due to the lightless interior of this tunnel. Uncertainty gave way to fear as I felt something jostle the first car in front of me. My voice wanted desperately to call out, but something inside of me was telling me to hide and not give away my presence. I sat there, covering my mouth as tears streamed between my fingers. After a moment of silence, I felt something brush the side of my cheek. It felt like warm air was hitting me, like someone was breathing on me. My eyes shifted to the right, and staring at me was a boy. My eyelids opened so wide I could feel my eyes beginning to sting. This boy's face wasn't right. His face held a bluish tint to it. Lifeless eyes rolled into the back of his skull. Greenish holes and scabs dotted his cheeks. His mouth hung slack as the sickly warm breath exhaled against me. Then, another breath hit me on my left, and I turned slightly towards it. This one was a girl's face. Long, greasy brown hair dangled from her scalp. One eye was missing entirely, while the other stared directly at me. I shrunk down in my seat as much as I could, and one by one, more faces began to appear. They all circled me like a twisted staring contest. Then, directly in front of me, a new face appeared. This one wasn't a child's face. It wasn't even human. In fact, it wasn't even really a face. Just a smooth, pale head cut through the darkness. No eyes, no nose. Just a large, jagged grin. Like somebody forgot to add the other features when making the face. Its teeth opened up like a metal gate, and a long tongue protruded out like a snake. Pointed, with strings of ichor dripping off of it. It pressed its tongue against my cheek, and finally, I screamed. I screamed so hard that I passed out. When I came to, I was outside in the grass with my parents. My mother was frantic while my father was checking to make sure I was okay. They asked me what happened, and I couldn't seem to answer them. My father mentioned that the ride was probably too intense for me and that I passed out as a result. I nodded apprehensively. He then helped me up, and as we were walking towards the exit, I looked back at the ride one last time. I can't be sure, but I thought I saw that same tongue scraping along the outside edge of that tunnel before slithering back inside. To this day, I'm not sure how I made it out of there alive and in one piece. I'm not even sure if what I saw really happened or if it was like my father said. Regardless, ever since then, I've refrained from going anywhere near a fair or a carnival. Whenever my father would take us on another road trip, and I'd see one of those fairs in the distance, I'd shudder and think about all those faces I saw in that tunnel, and how close I was to joining them.